Yeah, there must be.
Good.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's 5 p.m. here in Cape Town, South Africa. This is the Attaya seminar series hosted by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. My name is Ralph Borland. I'm a researcher here looking at the intersection of emerging technologies and healthcare in Africa. And today's guest is Susan Levine. And I'm really excited to have Susan here on the series because I've been looking at Susan's work for a while because of its intersection between the humanities, fine arts, and healthcare. So I'm also have a fine arts background. I went to Michaelis, UCT's art school, and I'm here now working on healthcare. And I'm really interested in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transdisciplinary work. And Susan's work really works at that intersection. So Susan is professor and head of anthropology at the University of Cape Town. And Susan is really passionate about interdisciplinary work. And in the write-up for today's seminar, Susan talked about her commitment to a more integrative model of teaching and learning in higher education, which leads to a more holistic view of the world. And that can bridge silos and create curricula that really bring in the potentials and the values of different disciplines. And also it invites and enables students to make connections between disciplines. And I certainly also feel from my experience that I've benefited from being able to move across disciplines in my own studies and research. So today, Susan is going to be basing the seminar off a paper that was published in the British Medical Journal. It's a co-authored paper with other authors, including a fine artist, Fritha Langeman. And the title of the paper is Toxic Layering Through Three Disciplinary Lenses, Childhood Poisoning and Street Pesticide Use in Cape Town, South Africa. And in the paper, Susan takes us through the phenomena of children being poisoned by agricultural pesticides. And part of the project is to personalize the experience, the individual children who are in hospital with perhaps just a single abbreviation on their diagnostic label identifying why they're there. And it's to fill out and give character and emphasize the individuality of these participants as one of the modes. So thank you very much, Susan, for joining us. We're really excited to have you here, and thanks for taking the time. And so I'm going to share your PowerPoint presentation from my side. I don't know if you'd like to say a few words first before we put up the share screen. And then you'll be visible at least for the start.
Finally. Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, I'll say just welcome to everyone. I know it's a difficult time of day for some of us, reaching the end of the day, or if you're overseas, early part of the day. So Ralph, thank you for inviting me to Attaya and Levine and HUMA. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this experiment in interdisciplinary research and mentoring and supervision, and seeing the kinds of projects that are being developed in the context of HUMA, and just those edges, those interdisciplinary edges, which provoke new ways of thinking, working in and out of disciplines, challenging disciplinary silos, while also deepening our own commitment to the disciplines that we were trained in. So I just want to say it's a real privilege to be here, and thank you so much. So Ralph, with that, yeah, let's do the slideshow. Ralph, thank you very much. I'm a technophobe, so it's really helpful to have you on board. Thank you.
Great.
Right, so this is a paper on interdisciplinarity based on some research that I've done over the years. And I think more so than focusing on my research, I'd like to think about methods for teaching and pedagogy, which invite us to think very carefully about the ways in which we can think specifically in and out of disciplines, and what it means to work with others, to embrace others in a kind of epistemic generosity rather than epistemic arrogance, what it means to listen, what it means to digest others' ideas. And so the idea of attaya, here's the coffee signaling a wonderful practice. I know Levine has thought carefully about the name of this seminar session. So here's 2 cups of coffee. So if you have coffee, great. I'd like to think together with us as we just have a shared conversation. So next slide, please. Thanks. All right, so I just want to begin thinking through the case study. I'm going to take it that you've read the paper, and if you haven't, I'll give you enough context. But I just want to begin with an idea from 2019. My colleague, I'm so honored to call Francis Nyamjo a colleague and someone who's inspired my thinking around pedagogy and what it means to think with the ideas of foregrounding new modes of research and thinking. And he wrote in 2019, he argued that any serious attempt at making African universities uncompromisingly inclusive institutions ought to embrace themes of interconnections, interdependencies, compositeness, and most importantly, incompleteness. And it's this idea of incompleteness, the idea that somehow we are through that which we are seeking to bridge, and recognizing that incompleteness lends itself, I think, in my own experience, to a real sense of epistemic generosity. And so what I'd like to do in this presentation is to think how all of us as scholars or artists who are also scholars, medical practitioners, I see Steve Reed is here, great inspirer of the medical humanities, have, before we were disciplined, we were engaged with all kinds of activities, all kinds of reading, different kinds of learning. And there was something about the process of beginning to think within disciplines that tended to cut us off and to create very narrow modes of thought. And I know Francis Nyamjo is a novelist as well as thinking with novels. And similarly, in thinking around rats and the place of rats, I've been reading Kai Miller's extraordinary novel, Augusttown. And just to open up the seminar, I want to read you just a very short piece from Augusttown that was extraordinary to me because it resonated so deeply with the ethnographic research that I was doing together with students from the University of Cape Town, who were students both of public health and of anthropology and of, in some instances, media studies, as we were putting together the story of how children in relatively insecure environments, like the one you can see here in the background. In fact, it's quite interesting if you look closely, there's a little insert which is taken from Augusttown in Kingston, Jamaica, inside a larger frame, which is taken in Kailicha, just here up the road. And so when we think with stories and traversing space, we can also use visual imagery to think with. So this is just a passage from Kai Miller's Augusttown to get us into the story of rats and to think about the interdisciplinary work. Irita Fari, otherwise known as Ma Taffy, is almost always calmly disposed, but the thought of rats makes her twitch. It was over 10 years ago. They had been breeding in the roof, a whole colony, rat mama and rat papa having plenty rat picnic, and those picnic having more rat picnic, and it had created that smell, thin and sour air. Thin and sour and choking. There were nightly scuttling sounds, and before long, rat shit started to drizzle around the house like a small, intermittent rain. Ma Taffy should have known long before the terrible thing happened that it was going to happen. On that night, she had been dreaming of a whistling sound. It was all around her. The whistling grew into a moaning. She opened her eyes, but it was so dark that she couldn't see the ever-expanding belly of the ceiling, how it was creakily reaching towards her. But she heard above the moaning, the frantic rats shrieking, hissing, swearing, chattering. The roof gave out with a pop, and she finally saw them, hundreds of snake-tailed rodents falling towards her, scrabbling the air, their beady eyes shining red in the dark. Ma Taffy sometimes thinks, how a coming autoclaps had made her open her eyes wide in anticipation instead of closing them for protection. The rats gouged out one eye completely and badly damaged the other. If she tips her head to a certain angle and looks out the lower portion, she can manage to see a shadowy gray world. But this takes so much effort and reveals so little that Ma Taffy hardly does so. Instead, she has grown used to the darkness. Okay, next slide, please. So the rat, the figure of the rat. The story that Kai Miller tells of dilapidated housing in this August town in Jamaica sounds very similar to much of the ethnographic data that, well, not data, but stories, narratives that people were talking about in homes where there's a very porous distinction between inside and outside, where there's very poor rubbish or municipal services to collect rubbish and take it away, where there's swampy areas of poor refuse and poor sanitation. And so there are rats and they proliferate. And so in a way, drawing on novels and stories about histories of rats works together with developing a much richer sense of the impact that rats have in terms of dwellings and the terror, and the horror and the fear. And so in developing a project around people's attempts to exterminate rats, to cleanse their house of the kinds of threats and horrors, it was important to work with the leading scientist on pesticides and poisoning of rats, Professor Andrea Rother from the School of Public Health here at UCT. And many of our students in public health and anthropology worked together to put together a story of how children were being very adversely affected by the different kinds of toxic poisonings that were used to exterminate rats. At the same time, or a bit earlier in 2012, 2013, Professor Frita Langeman, I'm sure many of you know her work from Michaelis, developed an extraordinary exhibition just called RAT, R-A-T, an associative ordering, which was at the Ezekiel South African Museum. And just to give you a tiny little glimpse into that exhibition, she writes, "The rat, an urban creature abhorred within the anthropocentric city, has been largely excluded from presentation in museums of natural history. Yet as an animal that is closely related to the development of human populations, the rat speaks as much to a cultural and social history as to a natural one. It is an icon of modernity, of disease, migration, stereotype, destruction, behavioral psychology, literature, and pharmacology. The rat straddles definitions, and in so doing, questions the premise of museums of natural history. What is meant by nature and what is natural?" So this is the figure of the rat that we were working with as a team, which again, branched into our teaching, into our supervision, and into research. And it was this project, which again, like our course Medicine and the Arts, which I'll talk a little bit later, always tries to bring into conversation an artist, a social scientist, and someone from the health sciences. All right, Ralph, next slide. All right, this is one of the, I just want to begin by giving you a little glimpse into some of the work that Frita did on rats, and particularly in terms of histories of rats who carry diseases and trouble communities and inflict all kinds of harms. And these are the different kinds of measures that were used to have been used over time to exterminate rats, including things like firing a projectile. You can have a look at some of these. There's one that I like, writing letters of eviction. That's from 1888. Ingestion of cow dung. And so this overview, this just points to all of these kind of decapitation being one. And what we see currently is a reemergence of some of these methods. Here's one, drowning, which I'll speak a little bit about, which has recently made something of a comeback in terms of how to grapple with the overpopulation of rats in contexts where there just isn't proper attention to municipal care. Okay, next slide. And here is another one of the pieces. This was two kind of medical jars, one of which you can see on the left-hand side, or my left-hand side, is diseases that are carried by rats, including things like bubonic plague, hepatitis, listeriosis, salmonella, fever, rabies, ringworm, all, there's hundreds actually of diseases that rats carry. And keep in mind that the rat is also a host animal. It's not just the rat, but it also has hundreds of smaller little microbial organisms and other kinds of fleas that live on the rat and other kinds of disease carrying. It's a kind of a taxi for, in some sense, of other kinds of disease carrying bacterium and etc. So the rat is a very complex character. And then on the other hand, while you have rats that carry disease, you also have rats used in disease research using rats. And rats have been used in all kinds of science, thinking with arthritis, cancer, and you can see these. And so Fritha then in her very layered exhibition is able to think with the rat and about the rat. All right, next slide. And here's another image of getting closer to the immediate study at hand, different impacts of different chemicals and pesticides and toxins and poisons that have been used to kill rats, and the extent to which how long the duration it takes for the rat to die, as well as what actually happens to the internal body of the rat, whether it's pleural effusion, blood clotting, internal hemorrhaging, organ failure, and heart paralysis. And so you get a sense from these images of the longue durée. Here's one, 3 to 6 days it takes for some rats to die. It's quite painful, I would imagine. And what we found in doing field work is that in speaking with caregivers of children who had ingested these poisons, which were then accidentally mixed on the floor, and we'll get to that in a moment, there was a kind of horror and terror that the kind of bubbling up of the insides of the rat would be the experience of children who were poisoned. Hence the need to find quite quickly alternatives to dealing with rat populations. Next slide, please. All right, and that's just another image which we can move on from. Thank you. Okay, so to get to the heart of the story, we had students just thinking about the interdisciplinary research that took place. We offered students from public health and from anthropology and visual arts to work together on this project. And first of all, we had to do the work of how very toxic pesticides were entering into people's homes from taxi ranks and train stations and little shops, spazas, into people's homes. And so we're talking about illegal pesticides, which are either mixed with water. They look like milk here, and you can imagine they can be misrecognized as milk. So many children and adults, but mostly children, who end up being poisoned by rat poisoning or toxins or pesticides that have been repurposed as rodenticides. Can misrecognize this as milk, could misrecognize it in some instances if it's clear as water. And so misrecognition is a massive problem, which the School of Public Health, together with our students, were trying to think through and thinking about campaigns and awareness. At the same time, students who were sort of wedded to political economy and radical social change were putting pressure on the state, on civil society, on service delivery, questions of inequality, and radical suffering actually at the coalface of this. So looking at it as an activist, from political angle, from media, from history, and trying to draw all these different strands together into some kind of story. And so we worked with teams of students working together across the disciplines. Some students were doing interviews or open-ended conversations. Others were taking photographs Others were working with city liaison people to try and identify how the pesticides were entering into public spaces and being sold. And we have published quite a few pieces. We've managed to make some headway with the city. And so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so just to show you what some of these poisons look like, on the right-hand side, the little black pellets, it's called Aldecarb. Aldecarb was produced by Bayer, it is produced by Bayer, which is, as you know, a huge pharmaceutical company, but it's also a massive distributor of harmful pesticides, which are sprayed onto our food, which is another story. But it is bound up in the idea of toxic layering and the kind of invisible harms that are present here in our environment. And this aldecarb was somehow siphoned off of farms, repackaged, and then sold as rodenticides, and they would then make their way into people's households for the purpose of exterminating rats. Next slide, please. Okay. And so with the story of the pesticides and toxicity, it was an invitation to think about, as an anthropologist, as a political economist, as someone who's interested in history, to also think about the theoretical models that we could work with to try and explain the particular instances of childhood poisonings in South Africa, but this is not a uniquely South African story. It's as common not as common, but it's also common. There are cases in New York, in the United States, really in Brazil, where you have a particular response to rodent control without the larger structural violence being really apprehended. And so the work that I've been drawing on in my capacity as a theorist is to work with Donna Goldstein. She's a medical anthropologist, and she has worked on environmental harms, toxic layering, which she calls invisible harms, environmental disaster, and the ways in which politics and power and capital and class and race begin to create these spaces in which environmental harms are most pressing. Donna Goldstein's work sits very well with Achille Mbembe's work, for those of you who've read Achille Mbembe's work on necropolitics and his idea of human abjection. He has theorized the ideas of waste in such a way that waste operates both on the level of waste as in wasted landscapes, environmental degradation, and the ways in which wasted bodies are folded into a discourse of necropolitics, in which there are communities of people who are treated in some sense, not necessarily, I mean, Achille stretches it a bit, to think about waste in the larger context of a lack of humanity. So this space then, very painful space for parents and caregivers for multiple reasons, thought about the moment of childhood poisoning itself as folded into a crisis-filled landscape, of which our students detailed in visual ways, in written ways, and trying to locate this particular story with the intent of, on the one hand, convincing Bayer to stop producing Aldecarb, which was successful. They did take Aldecarb off the market and make it illegal for consumption, though it's still dumped on farms and it's still entering into all kinds of settlements around the country. And so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there were new policies around sanitation that have been trying to put in place, but ultimately these are connected with much larger struggles which have been ongoing. And so the project itself was a teaching moment. It was a moment to reflect on different disciplines, and sometimes it was friction and sometimes it's really problematic. So there's a tendency among the public health students to want to find a kind of an immediate solution, a kind of a band-aid fix to, let's put labels on the bottles, let's do this. It was very, pragmatic, and our anthropology students were a bit less confident that there was a quick fix to something as egregious as this particularly toxic landscape when it came to children's well-being. And I just want to loop it back to the opening passage of Kai Miller's novel, and just a reminder that rats cause physical harm to children. They reported can bite, nibble toes and injure people while they're sleeping, as well as the psychological harm of hearing the rats in the ceiling, which was reported again and again, in addition to the disease-carrying elements of rats and their hosts. And so it is a very complex story that we've tried to weave together in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary mode, while also retaining our particular disciplinary interests. So you have the paper. I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but I would like to, I haven't checked the time. A few more minutes. Okay, Ralph, this is a good time to switch slides. Okay, so that's one case study. It's one of, I've given you a kind of a rushed view of the case study, but there's many more projects that I've worked on that try to replicate this model of working across the disciplines with artists, with social scientists, with medical practitioners, health practitioners, to produce something that produces multimodal ethnography, that produces multiple outputs, that doesn't necessarily try to per se do development work or intervention work, but also does the work of praxis, that is the blending of theory with practice and finding new vocabularies for thinking about questions of health and medicine. And I don't have time to go into the projects, but if you're interested, I can certainly send you lists of these different projects we've done, always with students and always with multiple faculty members. And so the medical and health humanities is an ongoing project in globally, and it has a particular footprint or imprint in South Africa. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a few developments which we're really proud of. And one is the medical health humanities in Africa, which is driven by historian Dr. Carla Tsampiris, who teaches in the primary healthcare directorate here. I see Steve Reed is here. And that is they have a very active Facebook page, and the kinds of projects, interdisciplinary projects, are just awesome in scale and scope, looking at the ways in which people have engineered fantastic art exhibitions to think about vaccine hesitancy, COVID, a whole range of workshops and conferences. So MHHA as a site and as a project has been absolutely instrumental for building an interdisciplinary space for thinking across the disciplinary silos. Next slide, please. Right, and this is I know Steve is smiling. This is our course. It's called Medicine and the Arts. It was sort of the early, it's a wonderful image here. Jonathan Morgan inspired body maps, and which was a way of storytelling, kind of an embodied way of storytelling. And for those of you who've gone to the health science faculty just down the road, well, very few of us have gone to campus recently, but for those of you who are there and have been there, you'll recognize these mosaics. Which Steve Reed and I, who started this course, Medicine and the Arts, many years ago, I can't remember now, I think maybe 6, maybe 7, began this course as an experiment, as an exploration. And just, I'll never forget that when we came up with the idea, it was explorations in medicine and the arts. And GRAPRO, who's our official body of making courses, said that we couldn't use the word exploration, because by the time you got to teach a course, you were there, you'd arrived, you were complete. And thinking with Francis Nyamjo's concept of incompleteness as a kind of generous space to work from, we did have to take the exploration part out of the title. So it is just Medicine and the Arts, which has currently become a key core MA course, interdisciplinary course called Health Humanities, Critical Health Humanities in Africa. But the Medicine and the Arts remains a MOOC on the Future Learn platform. Again, I'm not trying to advertise it, but if you're interested, it is there. It's currently running, I believe. And the MOOC brought together, I believe, about 30 staff, 30 people from UCT who are already doing the work. I think that all that we've done is to give a name to something that people have been doing for a long time, which is to think with one another, which is to try and work together, reading one another's work, thinking of alternative ways of expressing our own research in different modalities. And so we've been able to give a kind of a shape and a holding space to this. Humus is doing something very similarly, and you know, again, very excited to be part of this particular project. So that's out of interest. And then I think there's one more slide, and then I should be right on the dot. Yeah, okay. And then most exciting, and just to bring you all up to speed, there is a new Master's in Health, Humanities, and the Arts, which will launch next year, first thing in 2022. It's been a dream of ours for many years to host an MPhil in Health, Humanities, and the Arts, which again brings in history, fine art, dance, music, psychology, and anyone who's really, it's an open space really, to develop projects, research projects that bring people together to think of different problems and to really push knowledge production forward in a way that we recognize our incompleteness, and we recognize what we can gain from really the art of listening and learning. So that's all I think I want to offer right now for this session. And I'm just excited, well, looking forward to any questions or discussions that we may have. So thank you so much, and can turn off the PowerPoint.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Susan. That was great. Yeah. I was a slide changing machine. It's part of my machine learning role.
Thank you, Ralph. I have dyslexia, and I struggle with anything technological, which is just what it is. Thank you. I really appreciate you.
No, it's my pleasure. So yeah, we'll open the floor to questions, and yeah, a lot of fascinating material. There's Elisa Galgut who has her hand up. First out the gate. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Here we go. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Susan. That was really interesting. It's interesting how the humble rat gets, is such a key sort of evocative figure, actually. And in fact, while you were talking and you mentioned Bayer as making these rat poisons, I remembered that what was also interesting was that Bayer it's a German company, and it was one of the companies that was very instrumental during the Holocaust in experimenting on people in Auschwitz and Dachau without their consent. So there's also that history of poison and poisoning. And I was also just thinking, I'm just sort of associating a little bit to the image of the rat and why we found the rat so problematic. And of course, also, one of the things that the Nazis did was compare Jews to rats. And I was thinking, what is it about the rats that people find problematic? Okay, obviously it's dirty. But I think one of also the things about rats is that humans can't control them, right? So in various other ways, especially with domestic animals, either we have pets or we have animals in factory farms, and most of us don't deal with the blood and the shit and everything that happens on factory farms. But rats defy our ability to contain them, and they threaten our perception of ourselves as being in control of. So whenever there's any kind of degradation, whenever humans we fail to kind of keep our order on things, and then rats infiltrate. And I think rats are very scary for that reason as well, because they kind of remind us that unless we're very vigilant, the natural world is going to come in and kind of destroy. So I think there's a kind of psychological fear of rats that reminds us that we're not completely in control. And so I think that's an interesting, and that, sort of metaphor of the rat, something that, it's neither tame nor wild, and it's kind of human, isn't it, as well? It's got those little, human-like eyes. So I think all those sorts of interesting
Yeah,
associations.
I think, yeah, I mean, those are all really important points that you raise. And I just wanted to clarify, because I think I didn't, that Bayer doesn't produce rat poisons. Bayer produces agricultural pesticides.
Okay.
And one of the agricultural pesticides that has been found in the toxicology reports of children who've been dying, and I'm talking about 12 children a month, just at the Children's Red Cross Hospital here, poisoned, and either poisoned or what happens with Aldecarb is it fills the lungs up with fluid and the children suffocate, and it is terrifying. It is really scary and horrifying. And so the Aldecarb, and so what caregivers who want to keep spaces clean of rats, because there's no municipal services to keep spaces, I mean, free from infestation, to keep those spaces clean, the store-bought Ratex and things have not proven to be strong enough. And so the Aldecarb is lethal, almost immediately lethal to rats. And what happens is that then has been mixed with porridge, left on the floor for the rats. Children ingest the poison and get very, very sick. And so what happened when Andrea Rother and I, who went to speak to the director of Bayer in South Africa, he said, well, we don't make rat poison. We make agricultural pesticides. So we're not going to take it off the market. And we showed them the data of, what's been happening in places where it's been repurposed as a rodenticide, though it's not an official rodenticide. And he said, well, how many children have actually died? At which point you just throw your hands up in the air, because you don't, how many people need to die in these contexts. And so so I just wanted to make that point clear about Bayer, first of all. And secondly, a student of mine, Tula Sizwe Clements, he's just passed his MA thesis for a really brilliant thesis on the street sellers of these poisons, and looking at the ways in which the economy, sometimes, there's a problem and there's an economic opportunity to sell something. And what Tula Sizwe became quite fascinated in was the difference between pets and pests, and looking at class and race and the cleavages of when a rat is sort of living in a very comfortable, cage with a bed and water droplets, and when rats are, seen as pests. And so he follows rats through, he was working in Strand. And I mean, his thesis is really extraordinary. And I think he does what you suggest, which is to think with the rat as not just a metaphor, but it also has its own life and the way it impacts people differently. And what I appreciate about Kai Miller's novel, Augusttown, is the thick description. And I use that in the ethnographic sense, but sometimes the novelist does it much better than the anthropologist, is that thick description of what it means to have one's eye gouged out and not to be able to see the world in any other shade but gray, and to have the belly of your ceiling, collapsing on you with rat shit. And I think the horror of that is very real. And yet, from where we're sitting in, Cape Town now, there's a kind of vantage point where those of us who live in places with regular rubbish removal don't experience rats in that way. They're somewhat invisibilized, or maybe they pop up in a pet shop. So I do think that there's a politics to this and a political economy to rats and poison, which Frithe then, as the artist, was able to bring that deep history. The ways in which rats and humans have always developed together, with disease being some kind of bridge. Anyway, it's a long story, but I think it's really interesting. And, certainly the book Mouse, about the Holocaust, where the rats were the Jews and the Nazis were the cats, is reiterative of a very particular kind of fantasy, I suppose, about that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Fascinating.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Susan and Eliza. I see my colleague Dominique has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. My connection is quite unstable, so I might have to use my phone instead at some point. But Susan, thank you so much for this presentation. Fascinating. I have still very vivid memory of being peed on by rats in the cellings. It's yeah, it's real. I don't know if you know the work of Jeannie Sodikov. She's a colleague working on Madagascar on plague and rats. Her work is at the intersection of medical anthropology and anthropology of the environment. She's a professor at Rutgers, and your work made me think of hers that I've heard her present several times in workshop on Madagascar. And one of her papers discuss the importance of a multi-species approach to medical semiotics when try to investigate plague, for example. And one part of the work that scientists do and medical anthropologists do in those places is to elicit narratives from residents on the death of rats and the disease of rats and how it manifests, like in the street and in the house. What do rats look like when they are sick? So I was wondering if your ethnography, collective and individual collective research on rats and disease, if there's a particular work around those narratives. And I remember from one of her articles that she's saying that it becomes more and more difficult for people to notice the kind of change in rats' disease and death because of certain environmental changes and resistance to certain like poison, etc. And that people have more and more difficulty understanding their environment. So I was wondering if you had any experience of those things.
That's So we our students did this rich ethnographic narrative collecting of stories of rats, and one of the things that is really fascinating was incredibly disturbing is that what one had were stories about the death of the rat, right? The final scene of especially the pleural effusion in some of those images that that fit with all the tags and the different names of the poisons. Each poison has a different kind of resonance or reaction in the body of the rat. I think Dominique may be gone. Dominique?
Yeah, I think she's having internet issues.
She might be gone. It's okay.
She might be accessing through a different
device.
Yes,
I'm here. Sorry, my connection
okay,
doesn't
no, all good. So
maybe
one of the things
I can hear you.
Okay, so one of the things that people said was this terror about the death throes of the rat, because they saw the rat poisoned and in pain, and sometimes over a period of days. And then they would discard the carcass, and there was a fear that this might then happen, to their children when they were poisoned. And so one of the pushes in the Western Cape, you can hear from your phone. Thanks, Dominique. So one of the pushes in the Western Cape at a local level throughout the Western Cape was to move from poisoning rather to offering these boxes, these drowning boxes, which also, you saw that on the list for the things that drowning is quite an old, back in the 1800s, rats were being drowned. And the rat would then be enticed into a box and would then disappear into this drowning box so that it wouldn't be visible to the people in the home in terms of the rat's suffering. And apparently drowning must be awful, but it was seen to be a lesser form of terror for the rat than the poisons. And so from the perspective of the Department and School of Public Health at UCT, the drowning boxes also possibly create an alternative to these very toxic pesticides, which get into the water system, which get into the soil system, the kind of work that Leslie Green is doing, environmental humanities and other people around the world thinking about toxic landscapes. Imran Kudvadi has just written a book about toxic landscapes. And so what happened with the drowning boxes is that within the first week, of the drowning boxes being used as an alternative to poisons, the what's it called? The human, the animal rights. Sorry,
SPCA.
SPCA. Thank you.
SPCA.
Thank you, Dr. Galgut. The SPCA came in and said that drowning boxes were a form of very cruel killing, and they made it illegal. They just put a ban on all drowning boxes. And, you know, there are people whose, you know, children had been suffering from not just, you know, plague and other, you know, listeriosis and other diseases, couldn't believe that the SPCA was chiming in on animal rights for the rat, when humans were being, you know, exposed to such egregious forms of disease. And so there's been this huge contest between the animal rights activists. I don't want to say animal rights broadly speaking, but I do want to say that within the context of the SPCA, there was huge contests between local community leaders who wanted to see the drowning boxes and public health. And so people, so Andrea Rother was very concerned. And so what then happened in this debate is that Frithe Langermann's art pieces were then brought into the conversation for the SPCA to say, here, look at these examples of the days and hours in which the rat is in the death throes, as opposed to the drownings. Now, I mean, on the hierarchy of death and dying, and the rat, it's a complex, tragic, you know, story, I suppose, on some level. But you know, this was the politics of the rat in this context. And I think what you're describing, Dominique, in terms of thinking about the rat and toxicity, and the ways in which people were experiencing that on the ground, everything from, you know, where to dispose of the carcass, what children were exposed to in terms of the shrieking sounds that the rats made while it was dying, the kind of horror and terror of the bubbling up from the poison, you know, the rat traps that were ineffective because rats can figure out, they're very smart, they can get their way out of rat traps. So I'd love to read the work and maybe think of a comparative, you know, of how some of our students' work can maybe feed into a larger project. At the same time, there has been in anthropology what's called the animal turn, which I always, all these turns feel kind of dizzy from them. So the animal turn certainly leads into the multi-species, you know, what you're calling a kind of a semiotic or some kind of zeitgeist shift in thinking around a kind of post-humanist study where other species, particularly with COVID, we've seen with zoonosis, and the ways and those interactions between animals and humans. So increasingly, as medical anthropologists, as anthropologists, we are going to rely on zoologists, we're going to rely on botanists, on biologists, on, you know, I think this is where the interdisciplinarity really comes to play when working through these very complex terrains of health and environment. Yeah. But thanks, Dominique. I'm going to get the detail from you. I'd absolutely love to read their work.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Dom. Yeah, I'm interested in how both Elisa and Dom's contributions are around, you know, the rat and the associations around the rat, and it makes me think of the way you describe Frithe's exhibition as being using associative ordering and this choice to take an object, the rat, and then to radiate out from it all of these connections and points. And I think it's a technique that I'd feel familiar with working as an artist, which is to pull out all of this material that you can from a chosen object, and this associative way of linking that sometimes can at first seem superficial perhaps, but actually reveals, you know, so ends up revealing important connections. And it's a partly almost like intuitive process where you connect things together through surface characteristics, but then you make more out of those connections. So I guess I wanted to ask you, leading from that, your interdisciplinary way of working, in particular in relationship to working with artists, what do you think you learn from artists and from art processes? I mean, in particular, if you were to explore that question.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. I think it'd be difficult to distill. So what I've learned, I mean, one thing it's about how, okay, so one, I mean, there's multiple, it's multiple. Working with artists in terms of thinking with dance and music and fine art and film and photography has enabled me to think about what it means to reach an audience. I mean, really reach an audience. So as an academic who's grown up in anthropology, which is a discipline that has a very particular language, which is quite specific to the discipline. And so in trying to convey everyday stories, we tend to take everyday stories and turn them into something that's so opaque and so impenetrable and so dense that it's not something that can easily translate and be meaningful to people outside of one's discipline. And so working, you know, for example, with Fritha and Andrea Rother, just for instance, on this project, or having worked on huge HIV/AIDS campaigns with filmmakers from Day Zero Productions and currently working with Sunshine Cinema documentary film, and seeing things from an artist's perspective, there's a capacity to work through a difficult language, but it's changed the way I want to communicate. It's changed the way I want to tell stories. So for instance, a colleague and I are working on a project on adoption, and we will do that. We could do that through really deep kind of anthropological speak about kinship and thinking about lineage through lines and, you know, drawing on Tim Ingold's work on lines and getting super intellectual, which we will do and which we will have to do, right, for our careers and publications. But thinking with photography and what it would mean to tell a story in a visual way, or to teach students to go, and when they do their observational work, rather than taking field notes and writing, to draw, you know, to use lines to draw, and then to be able to use those impressions to bring those back into their analysis, just to try and, I guess, create a breathing space whereby we're not necessarily regimented by a particular way of knowing, to be able to think with all of our senses. And that doesn't mean that all anthropologists need to become artists, or that all anthropologists need to work with the artists. But for me, from where I'm sitting, it has really helped me to think about audience and communication and what different kinds of practices do to communicate. That's on the one level. On another level, no, we're running out of time. On another level, as a medical anthropologist and someone who's very passionate about working in hospitals and in clinical spaces, working with artists has also meant troubling or interrupting the medical gaze, interrupting the medical touch, interrupting the experience that patients have, say, in waiting rooms or in the clinical encounter, by bringing music, by bringing dance into those spaces, which is just starting to happen in South Africa, but to a much larger extent overseas in other contexts, in really robust programs, arts in medicine programs, in which health services is beginning to reach out and to completely transform the experience of being, an administrator or a health professional, nurse, cardiologist, in those or a patient in those spaces. So I also think that working with artists and inside and outside disciplines can change an entire ethos of feeling in that sense, that you're no longer siloed off in spaces, but you can populate them with different modalities of expression and beauty, really.
Yeah, thank you for that exploration.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like artists can be bridges. They can be glue or boundary workers or bridges between
That's
disciplines.
beautiful. Yeah, bridges and boundary. Yeah, I love that. That's there it is. You said it. You're the artist. You see. So Fritha, for me, and other artists were able to really crack. Force me to ask and force our team to ask questions that we wouldn't have asked. So when Fritha came on board, her first comment upon listening to the stories of people and Andrea Rother and Public Health's campaign was, well, what about the rat? And everyone kind of threw their arms up like, well, what about the rat? But she made us ask that hard question, which then brought us into a whole other world of suffering, which was quite painful, actually. And I don't think we would have got that without that bridge.
Yeah. Yeah, no, interesting. Yeah, I'm starting out a research project at Tygerberg Hospital with a 3D printing unit there. And I think that, yeah, I feel that capacity for access that artists can also practice, how you're able to access different spaces because you don't quite fit into a prescribed box or expectation of what channels you're meant to go through. So we end up getting into interesting spaces as a result.
Yeah, and I also think it's going to force the university. Part of the reason that I was excited to give the seminar was to really impress upon the university that excellent research can happen and excellent production can happen when we work in an interdisciplinary format and framework for teaching. And the question is, how do we make things count? So many of our students in anthropology would really rather make a film as their final thesis product. Or I know we have a poet here, whose work may be beautiful and read and enticing, but doesn't necessarily always get counted as an academic output, say, for promotion. So the question of how we push the university into the future, and this is the future part, how we press the university into the future is to think about the fact that rigidly speaking, within disciplines is not going to enable the kind of concepts that I think Professor Nyamjo has articulated so well in terms of a humbleness, a nimble-footedness, as he calls it, and conviviality, and the sense of being incomplete, and constantly acknowledging that and knowing that there's ways of working across disciplines and also working with people who are outside of the university altogether, who are so inspiring. That I would love to see the university reach a place where interdisciplinarity is part and parcel of the experience, and that students have the capacity to enter as full beings and not be cut off at the limbs, so to speak.
Yes, and we have to push the institution to
push the institution,
to credit that. Yeah.
Because it's not just, they're talking about interdisciplinarity, but in terms of programs that are being, funded and supported, it's still a real, scramble to kind of find ways to make them fit and then to find the support for them. But we're getting there, and it's very exciting. I mean, Huma is one sterling example of, really making it work, and it's just brilliant.
Yes, great, thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.
We're almost at the end of time, but I see Elisa has her hand up. Do you have a quick comment or question there?
Well, just a quick comment, because I just was thinking about Susan referencing the use of the rat in medical experiments as well.
Yeah.
And it also just made me think about this thing about interdisciplinarity, because, of course, when you experiment on animals, on rats at UCT and elsewhere, all the protocols have to go through animal ethics committees, and the care that is taken with regard to the suffering and analgesia, and I mean, it's how the rat is treated is given such enormous care. But then, of course, on the other side, we've got rats who are just a UCT has got rat boxes outside the very medical research centers, where the rats inside are treated really well, but the rats outside are just poisoned. And it's exactly that kind of split thinking that I think that you're talking about. And the rat is an interesting space to think about how humans' contradictions sort of come together in the figure of the rat. And I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And get back to Tula Suswe's thesis, which if anyone's interested, pets or pests, it's just a really fascinating thesis. Yeah.
I live in a suburb called Observatory. For those of you in Cape Town will know what I'm talking about. And I was sitting in a restaurant, and I noticed that the person at the next table had a rat on their shoulder, and it was their pet rat. Which, if you know observatory, you'll be like classic obs. But it also just highlighted the place of this rat. That, you know, if the rat was in the kitchen, it would be a different story. But the rat is with the, you know, with the patron, and it's a clean pet. Yeah.
Absolutely about context. Absolutely about context. 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Were they having ratatouille?
I think maybe it was the cook on a break. Could it be?
Yeah.
Could have.
But yeah,
Great.
no, absolutely. So it is about context. And of course, in South Africa, whenever there's context, there's inequality. And so that's really what the so sorry. Whoa. I don't know. I turn that off.
It's reminding you that we are just over time. So, yes, you're still muted, Susan. But thank you. I'll ask you to unmute. Okay, I think. Are you? Oh, there you go. Here you are.
There we go. All right.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks very much, Susan. That was really great. Very lively presentation and discussion, and really thank you for contributing to our series here. That's
a pleasure.
Really
Thanks everyone, and look forward to all the Ataya seminars moving forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, Ralph.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.